This is the account of Jesus appearing to the disciples, as I said, a week later. And it says, "Now Thomas, called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. And so the other disciples told him, 'We have seen the Lord.' But he said to them, 'Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it.' A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. And though the doors were locked," let that sink in for a second. Although the doors were locked, they were closed, shut tight. Jesus came and stood among them and said, 'Peace be with you.' And then he said to Thomas, 'Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe.' And Thomas said to him, 'My Lord and my God.' And then Jesus told him, 'Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen me and yet have believed.' And Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." During his long career as a pastor in New York's Riverside Church, the late Henry Emerson Fosdick, he spent many hours counseling students from nearby Columbia University. And one evening, this young man came in. He was beside himself, and he burst into his study and he announced, "I have decided that I cannot and do not believe in God anymore." "All right," Dr. Fosdick replied, "but describe for me the God that you don't believe in." And the student proceeded to sketch out his idea of God. And when he finished, Dr. Fosdick said to him, "Well, we're in the same boat. I don't believe in that God either." Do you have doubts sometimes about your faith? Today we're going to be looking at just that, the disciples' doubts. You see, the single greatest message we have is that we serve a risen Savior. That he is no longer in the grave. That he is risen from the dead. You see, without a risen Lord, all we have is a great teacher who died a horrible death. But we have a risen Lord, and this can be a hard truth to grasp. Because when someone dies, well, they're dead, and there's no coming back. But Jesus came back. He conquered the finality of death. He rose from the dead. But as I said, this can be a hard truth to believe. The two men from Emmaus, whom Jesus had appeared to, were so excited about Jesus' appearance that they ran back to Jerusalem. When they arrived, they found where Jesus' followers had assembled together. And the men from Emmaus quickly discovered that Simon Peter had too seen the risen Lord, had seen the risen Christ, just as they had. And so they proceeded to tell of their encounter with Jesus and how he had walked with them, how he had talked with them, how he had told them about all of the prophecies in the Old Testament leading up to where they were. And then he broke bread with them and then disappeared. Can you imagine the excitement that I'm sure was beginning to build as they told each other of their encounters, as they told each other of what had taken place, what was going on? One might suspect that the assertions of only one or two people who claimed they had seen Jesus alive. Really? Are you sure you saw him? Now, however, the testimony from credible witnesses was becoming more and more persuasive. He was appearing not just to the ladies at the tomb, not just to Peter, not just to the two at the Emmaus Road, but there he is in their very midst. As it says in Luke 24:36, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." We don't have recorded here the conversations that were taking place in that room, but I can imagine that somebody probably said, "Hey, John, I told you to lock the door." But I did. And there he was in their midst, even with a locked door. To say that the men in this room were surprised, I think is an understatement. A significant understatement. Jesus was dead. Some of them had seen him die. They had watched him being carried to Joseph's tomb. They saw him being placed in it. And despite the reports that he was alive again, to witness his sudden appearance in the middle of the group and in a room where the doors were shut and locked, startling. I would say startled. It says they were startled and frightened. Well, they thought that they had seen a ghost. And to calm their fears, Jesus says to them in Luke 24:39, he says, "Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see I have." And one of the things in John's gospel that it says is, "Touch my side." If you remember, while he was on the cross, they came to break the legs of them all and realized that he was already dead. So they didn't break his legs, but they stabbed him in the side. And it says blood and water flowed. And so he says, touch my hands, touch my feet, but touch my side as well. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost doesn't have flesh and bone. You may have seen or heard of a ghost, but everyone knew that a ghost did not have flesh and bone. So Jesus offers them his hands and his feet. And there they found the wounds from the nails that held Jesus to the cross. As I said, John notes that Jesus also told them to place his hands on their side. He wanted the disciples to be 100% completely convinced that he is who he said he is, and that he's standing right there. You see, the spreading of the gospel was going to be entrusted to these people, to these men and to these women, and they must be absolutely certain of Jesus' bodily resurrection. We usually think of Thomas as the doubter, and yet these disciples, as we see in Luke 24:41, it says they still did not believe because of joy and amazement. In other words, they thought Jesus' presence among them was just too good to be true. It was hard for them to allow this truth to sink into their brains and make sense of it all. So Jesus asked them for a piece of fish to eat. This further proved that he was not a ghost. He was not an illusion. He was there with them in the flesh. However, the doubt. Thomas said, unless I see, I will not believe it. Unless I see. When Jesus had proposed to go to Bethany, this is before the crucifixion, before all of that stuff. They were going to the home of Lazarus. They had heard the news of Lazarus' illness, and Thomas' reaction to this is interesting. In John chapter 11, verse 16, Thomas said this. Sometimes we give him a bad rap as the doubter, but listen to what Thomas said. Long before any of this had happened, he said, let us also go that we may die with him. He was willing to go to Jerusalem, knowing that Jesus was an outlaw, that people were looking to kill him. He was willing to go. You see, Thomas never lacked courage, but I suspect that Thomas was a natural pessimist. Anybody here half empty glasses? There's a few of us there amongst the monks, amongst the group. You know, I sometimes think of myself as a half full kind of guy, more so than half empty. But Thomas here was, I'm sure, a pessimist. Thomas loved Jesus. Thomas loved Jesus so much that he went to Jerusalem to die with him. And Jesus did die as he expected him to. And you know what? I believe that this broke Thomas's heart so much that he grieved for Jesus alone. It says that he was not with the disciples the first time Jesus appeared to them. Where was he? He was somewhere else. I suspect that he was alone, grieving. And when he heard the news that Jesus had come back, it seemed to him far too good to be true, and he refused to believe. He said he would never believe that Jesus had risen from the dead until he had seen and touched. And so a week later, they were all there. And it says Thomas was there with them. And Jesus appeared. I love the way that the Living Bible puts this in John chapter 20, verse 27. It says, "Put your finger into my hands. Put your hand into my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe." Don't doubt. Don't be faithless. Believe. Jesus wasn't hard on Thomas for his doubts. Despite his skepticism, Thomas was still loyal to the believers and to Jesus himself. Some people need to doubt before they believe. If doubt leads to questions, and questions lead to answers, and answers are accepted, then doubt has done its good work. It is when we doubt and become stubborn, and in our stubbornness, it becomes a lifestyle that doubt harms faith. When you doubt, don't stop there. Let your doubt deepen your faith as you continue to search for the answer. You see, Thomas needed to know for himself. He did not want to take someone else's word for it. He had to see. Anybody like that here? It's hard to take somebody else's word for something. You need to experience it yourself. He did not want to pretend that he believed. But this doubt led to questions. Questions led to answers, and answers, when they are accepted, led to a greater faith. "My Lord and my God," Thomas said in John chapter 20, verse 28. That is all in. That is 100% commitment. That is 100% belief. That is not halfway faith. That is full faith in that statement. Thomas was not voicing doubts just for the sake of debate. Thomas doubted in order to become sure. And when he did become sure, his surrender to Christ was complete. See, Thomas fought his way through his doubts to the conviction that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God, the Lord himself. A fellow by the name of David Holloway, he shares in his book called The Life of Jesus about a man by the name of Lew Wallace. I don't know if you know who Lew Wallace is, but you're gonna. After 6 years given to the impartial investigation of Christianity as to its truth or falsity, Lew Wallace said, "I have come to the deliberate conclusion that Jesus Christ is the Messiah of the Jews, the Savior of the world, and my personal Savior." These were the words of Lew Wallace. He was the governor of New Mexico. And as you can tell by the picture, it was quite a while ago that he was the governor of New Mexico. But he decided to write a book against Jesus Christ. And in the process, he was converted to Christianity. He told a friend how it happened. He said, "I had always been an agnostic and denied Christianity. Robert C. Ingersoll, a famous agnostic, was one of my most intimate friends. And he once suggested, 'See here, Wallace, you are a learned man and a thinker. Why don't you gather material and write a book to prove the falsity concerning Jesus, that no such man has ever lived? much less the author of the teachings of the New Testament. Such a book would make you famous. It would be a masterpiece and a way of putting an end to the foolishness about the so-called Christ. The thought made a deep impression on me, he said, and we discussed the possibility of such a book. I went to Indianapolis, my home, and told my wife what I intended. She was a member of the Methodist Church, and naturally she did not like my plan at all. But I decided to do it and began to collect material in libraries here and in the old world. I gathered everything over that period in which Jesus Christ, according to legend, should have lived. Several years were spent in this work. I had written nearly 4 chapters when it became clear to me that Jesus Christ was just as real a personality as Socrates or Plato or Caesar. The conviction became a certainty. I knew that Jesus Christ had lived because of the facts connected with the period in which he lived. I was in an uncomfortable position. I had begun to write a book to prove that Jesus had never lived on earth. Now I was face to face with the fact that he was just as real, as historic as Julius Caesar or Mark Antony or Virgil or Dante, and a host of other men who had lived in olden days. I asked myself a question. If he was a real person, and there was no doubt in my mind anymore, if he was a real person, was he not then also the Son of God and the Savior of the world? Gradually, the consciousness grew that since Jesus Christ was a real person, he probably was the one he claimed to be. He says, I fell on my knees to pray for the first time in my life, and I asked God to reveal himself to me, forgive my sins, and help me to become a follower of Christ. Towards morning, the light broke into my soul, and I went into my bedroom, woke my wife, and told her that I had received Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. And her response was, oh, Lou, she said, I've been praying for you ever since you told me of your purpose to write this book, that you would find him while you wrote it. Lew Wallace did write a very famous book. It was a masterpiece, and it was the crowning glory of his life's work. He changed the book he was originally writing, and he used all his research to write another book. Now, every time that you may watch the epic film made from his book, where you see Charlton Heston racing those 4 magnificent white horses in that amazing chariot race, or maybe you've seen the newest one that they put out, I wonder how many who have been Ben-Hur, with its moving references to Jesus, how it was written by a man who wanted to disprove that Jesus ever existed and instead became convinced that he was the greatest man who had ever lived. So now when you see Ben-Hur, now you know what? The rest of the story. In John chapter 20, verse 29, it says this. It says, then Jesus told them, you believe because you have seen me. But blessed are those who haven't seen me and believe anyway. Some people think they would believe in Jesus if they could see a definite sign or a miracle. But Jesus says we are blessed if we can believe without seeing. We have all the proof we need in the words of the Bible and the testimony of people who believe. And if you need proof that Jesus lives, well, here it is. Here it is. I grew up in a home where we did not go to church. I grew up in a home where my father did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God. I learned it well. But it was through my next door neighbors and my great-grandmother that faith came to my life. And I believed, and what a change it has made. Because I am not the same person I was before I came to know the living Christ. You need proof? Here it is. Let's pray together.